Bret the Hitman Hart was on the Broken Skull sessions with Stone Cold Steve Austin. I've enjoyed these interviews. He's done a whole bunch of them by now. The Undertaker one is one of the best that he's done, just because Undertaker doesn't do very many of those types of interviews. And Undertaker's been around forever. I feel like this company, he's been around longer than pretty much everybody. And his memory is still pretty good. Some guys will do interviews and they don't remember shit. I'll listen to like Eric Bischoff give an interview every now and then. The guy is so full of shit. It's obvious that he doesn't remember a whole lot of what was going on back then. Some guys just don't remember, or they have terrible memories. Undertaker seemed like he's got all of his faculties. He remembers all the stories, despite all the drinking and the partying and all the stuff he's been through over the years. So that was a very compelling interview to me. The interview with Big Show, I think Big Show gives a great interview. I thought the Big Show interview was great. This one was no different. This was Bret being Bret. The most Bret Hart thing you could imagine is how they started the interview. He was asking Bret about a vacation that he had just taken. They just came back, I guess, him and his wife from Hawaii. And he was complaining. He was complaining because I guess it rained. So he asked him about his Hawaiian vacation. His first thing was to complain about his vacation to Hawaii. And I thought, that's Bret Hart. What can I say? That's the Hitman. So the first thing Austin wanted to start with, I guess it's good they got it out of the way, but they spent 15 or 20 minutes on this, was what else? The Montreal Screwjob. I mean, look, I guess you can't do a sit-down interview with Bret and not at least broach the subject. But my God, with this Montreal, even Dark Side of the Ring on Vice last year did a whole episode on Montreal. And it was probably the weakest or one of the weakest of the bunch. Not because the story isn't compelling if you've never heard it before, but just when you've heard it a gazillion times. It's like, come on now. So yeah, they dove right into Montreal, and Bret's been always fairly consistent in the story that he's told about why this all happened. When you think back to it, why did this even happen in the first place? Was it just that Bret was a mark for himself and didn't want a job? Was that really the answer to all of this? No. It all goes back. There was an event in San Jose, and that was when Bret found out that he was going to work with Shawn at Survivor Series in Montreal. And Shawn had thanked Bret for the match that took place that night. I guess Shawn was the referee in San Jose for Bret's match against whoever it was. Might have been Undertaker. And Bret said to Shawn, he goes, look, I know this was only a few weeks after they had their hair-pulling fight backstage like a bunch of girls back in June. I think it was June of 97. And so this was a few months earlier. These guys literally were ripping each other's hair out of their heads and had to be broken apart. So Bret said, look, I know that we're going to be working in Montreal, and I just wanted you to know that I'm willing to put you over as a way to kind of broker a peace here. It's like, I'm willing to put you over anytime. And he was being very magnanimous. This is Bret's version of events. I've never heard Shawn dispute this before, but this has always been Bret's version of how this went down. It's traced back to this day in San Jose. He says this to Shawn, and Shawn says, well, I appreciate that, but I just want you to know that I'm not willing to do the same for you. And he walked away. And that's what kicked this whole thing off. It was the idea that in his mind, in Bret's mind, I'm willing to put you over. I'm willing to let bygones be bygones. Let's put the past behind us. Let's be pros here. I'm willing to do the right thing. I'm willing to put you over. And the fact that Shawn said, well, I appreciate that, but just so you know, I'm not willing to do the same for you. So the next day is when Vince told Bret that, hey, Shawn's going to win the championship. He's going to beat you at Survivor Series. And Bret said, well, wait a minute. He goes, no. First of all, he did bring up the whole 60 days of creative control in the final 60 days of his contract. And look, if it's in his contract, it's in his contract. Don't blame Bret for that. Blame Vince McMahon for putting in the damn contract. That's why you don't give guys 60 days, 90 days, 100 days, permanent creative control. I mean, WCW gave it to Hogan. Vince McMahon wouldn't give it to Hogan. But it was an honor thing with Bret. He goes, if this guy's not willing to put me over, then you know what? Fuck him. I'm not willing to do the same for him if he's not going to do it for me. Why should this only come from one side? So he got into that whole story, and Austin said that Vince was basically trading you in, it sounds like, for a younger horse. And Bret says, look, I offered to drop the title to anybody else. I even offered to drop it to Shawn on Raw the night after Survivor Series. But he said Shawn had to be willing to put me over before I put him over. I guess he had already put him over at WrestleMania 12. They were going to wrestle at WrestleMania 13 at one point. That didn't happen with Shawn's wonky knee. He said Shawn has to be willing to put me over or put me over before I do the same for him. And that's where we were. And then at that point, things just went south. We all know how it ended up. And they showed footage from the match in Montreal, and Austin thought they were having a great match. They were having this great 15, 16, 17-minute match up until what ended up happening. Bret told the story again of seeing Earl Hebner in Detroit in the lead up to the match. This might have been the night before. And, Bret claims he was worried about there being some kind of a screw job. And Earl swore on his kid's life. He said, I would never, ever do anything like that to you. If I'm the referee for your match, I swear on the life of my children, I would never do anything to screw you over like that. And Earl had been with the company for ages, and he had refereed a lot of Bret's matches, and Bret trusted him. He said, okay, I feel at ease now. Now, he wasn't sure that Earl Hebner was going to be the referee for the match. He was hoping, after hearing that Earl would be the ref. And then he came to find out the next day that, in fact, Earl had been assigned to the match. And he kind of breathed a sigh of relief because he trusted Earl Hebner. The guy swore on his children's lives. I mean, my God. How can I not trust somebody like that? Of course, Earl Hebner was put in an impossible spot because as he's about to go out there, he gets pulled aside and said, listen, we need you to do this. And that's it. And I don't know if they outright told him that if you don't do it, you're going to be fired. But in his mind, he's probably thinking, well, I could lose my job. I got to do what I'm told. I got to make money. I'm a referee. I'm a lot more expendable than Bret Hart or Shawn Michaels would be. And Bret doesn't hold any animosity towards Earl. He says, if I were in his shoes, I don't know, maybe I would have done the same thing that Earl did. He can't be sure. And then he got into the locker room situation. Undertaker didn't wrestle that night. If you remember, Undertaker didn't have a match at Survivor Series, but he was there. He was in the back, and he was pissed. He was really upset. And I kind of wish that Austin would have brought this up. Or did he bring it up? I don't think he did during the Broken Skull interview he did with Undertaker. I don't know. I don't remember this coming up or not. I know it came up in the Michael Landsberg interview. Actually, no, it didn't. I take that back. That was WrestleMania 14. That was a different incident with Shawn Michaels when Undertaker was taping up his fists. So I would love to hear from the Undertaker's mouth what he remembers. Since his memory is so good, I'd love to know what he remembers from that night. But according to Bret, and Austin, who was there as well, Undertaker was incensed. He was saying, fuck it. He was kicking over garbage cans. He told Vince, you got to make this right. You got to go apologize to Bret. You got to go face the man face to face. Because Vince had locked himself in his office. And so eventually they did, have a meeting of the minds, shall we say, in Bret's locker room. And Bret's walking around naked. He did briefly think about attacking Vince, jumping him basically while he was naked. And they had a nice laugh about that. He said, what a visual that would have been. He goes, I thought better of that. I didn't want to jump on Vince buck naked. But he was going to go take a shower. He said, listen, if you're still here when I get out, I'm going to knock you out. And when he came out of that shower, there was Vince. And he described the punch. He said it was more of an uppercut. It wasn't like a sucker punch or an overhand punch. It was an uppercut. And it lifted Vince off the ground, and Vince, fell to the ground. Now, he didn't get into the other details that had been told about what happened in the big pull-apart. Shane McMahon was there. Somebody stepped on Vince's ankle. It might have been Briscoe or somebody by accident. I don't know if it broke Vince's ankle or just injured it, but somebody stepped on Vince's ankle. British Bulldog had his knee brace off when all of this was going down, and he ended up, I think, twisting or hyperextending his already injured knee. There's a lot of people that got injured, not just Vince. Vince got punched in the face, but a lot of people got hurt. A lot of egos got hurt. Shawn, of course, denied the whole thing. He was crying, head in his hands. And Bret shook his hand. Bret believed him, or maybe he didn't, but he took Shawn at his word. He put his hand out to shake Shawn's hand, to thank him for the match. I trust that you didn't know about this. You had nothing to do with this. And he put his hand out to shake Shawn's hand for the match that they just had. I will always be pissed that Bret sent the documentary crew out of that locker room, Because he said he wishes that he had told the guy to keep recording at least part of it. But when Vince and everybody came into the lot, you could see it in the documentary Wrestling with Shadows. He basically said, turn the camera off. But that's what you would have wanted to get on camera, though. I would have just told the guy, hey, pretend the camera's off. Go hang back in the corner of the room. Imagine if we got all of that on tape. Now, maybe I don't need to see buck naked Bret Hart walking around. You could always blur that out. But man, imagine if it's like, it's this big legend that's been built up of this fight and this knockout punch over the years, and I would have loved to have gotten that on video. We do have Vince McMahon on video limping, stumbling out of the locker room, and Briscoe and the people with him saying, just keep your head down. The camera was in the hallway filming that when Vince walked out. You could see, I'm assuming Vince is limping because somebody stepped on his fucking ankle. So again, we've all heard this story before. It is fascinating, though, to visualize what that locker room confrontation looked like, and the Undertaker being pissed and everything. And anyway, so that was the whole Montreal thing. So then they talked about WCW and how WCW didn't know what to do with Bret. And Bret said, look, I mean, I was the hottest guy in wrestling. I had beaten the Undertaker. I was the champion, right? He said I'd beaten you. As in Austin, I'd beaten Undertaker at SummerSlam. I was the champion. I didn't really lose to Shawn. There was all this controversy around me, and WCW got me. They brought me in, and they did not know what to do with me. They had Bret Hart refereeing a match. That was really his first appearance in WCW as a fucking referee. And he said, I should have been wrestling Hulk Hogan. I should have had Hulk Hogan in the sharpshooter. Now, WCW was doing the Hulk Hogan Sting program at that time heading into Starrcade. You can't disrupt that. I mean, that was built up for like a year and a half. I understand what Bret is saying. Do you put Bret on ice and hold him until January and risk, kind of all the momentum and all the controversy around him dying down? Or do you bring him and put him on TV right away and strike while the iron is hot? Well, if you do that, what do you do with him? Because Hogan is already occupied with Sting. I just think they could have come up with something a little bit better than just having him be a referee. But yeah, they should have absolutely capitalized on that and done a lot more with Bret up front than they did. And, he really was. He was the hottest name. He was the most talked about name in wrestling for that period of a month or two after Montreal. And they squandered that. Now, one of the key points of the interview that I loved was just listening to Bret and Austin go back and forth talking about, their not just their matches together, but what makes a great match. I could listen to Bret talk all day about that kind of stuff. He was talking about the difference in his mind between a great match and a classic match. Because a classic match is a match that people are going to talk about years later. It's not a match where, wow, those two went out and had a great match, and then maybe in a month or a few weeks you forget about it. It's a match that lasts a lifetime. And when I think about Bret's career, and one of the reasons why he's my favorite of all time, is he has as long of a list, if not longer, than practically anybody in the history of WWE when it comes to classic matches. The only person I could think of who maybe has a longer list, and a lot of that has to do with just the fact that his career ended up being a lot longer than Bret. Bret had to retire. Shawn Michaels had this whole second career, this whole comeback when he came back from all of his demons and the back surgery and everything else. It was like Shawn Michaels' pre and post back surgery, the tale of two careers. Bret didn't have that chance. Imagine if Bret had even 5 more years and could wrestle Kurt Angle and all these different people, Brock Lesnar in WWE. Imagine the other classic matches he could have put together. The classic matches that I think of when I think of Bret, it's not so much the Hart Foundation matches. I think those are great matches. 2 out of 3 falls against Demolition at SummerSlam, and the matches that the Hart, I guess you could say the matches that the Hart Foundation had in the mid '80s with the Bulldogs. I can't think of one specific match, but they had a whole series of classic matches against each other. But when I think of Bret's career and I think of the classic matches that he has had, I think of the 2 matches on pay-per-view that he had with Curt Hennig, the Mr. Perfect match at SummerSlam, and then the rematch at the King of the Ring in '93. which was even better in my opinion than the SummerSlam match. Him and the Bulldog headlining Wembley Stadium in front of 80,000 people at SummerSlam. Him and Owen, both matches they had in 94, WrestleMania 10, and the cage match later that year at SummerSlam. The matches he had with Austin, specifically the WrestleMania 13 match, which is one of the best matches in the history of that company. The matches he had with Shawn, I don't know that he ever had that one classic match with Shawn Michaels. I mean, some people would say the Iron Man match. I'm not as big of a fan of that as a lot of other people are. But yeah, some people would throw the Iron Man match at WrestleMania on that list. You know, and there's others I'm sure I'm not thinking of. I'm thinking now even in terms of TV matches. You know, the Raw match in 94 with the 1-2-3 Kid. You know, he had another match with Bulldog, the one in Hershey at that In Your House pay-per-view. The body of work that Bret put together was tremendous. You know, and the stories that, and I keep thinking to the King of the Ring pay-per-view in 93. Each match was different. Each match was a different opponent. Each match told its own story. The opening match with Razor Ramon, the stomping on the fingers, injuring the fingers, carrying that over into the match with Perfect, carrying those injuries, you know, into the final match with Bam Bam Bigelow, the biggest opponent, you know, of the night for him. It's one of the reasons why that's one of my all-time favorite pay-per-views. It wasn't just the matches. It was, you know, the story that Bret tried to tell throughout all three of the matches that he had that night. And then they capped it off with Jerry Lawler showing up and beating the hell out of him. But that's the difference in his view between a great match and a classic match. How many matches are there going to be that people are going to still be talking about 10, 15, 20, 25 years later? Bret has got as many as anybody. And that's why he is one of the best that the company has ever had, despite what Jake Roberts would say. I know Jake the Snake Roberts was mouthing off on a podcast this week about Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels both being two of the worst champions in the history of WWE. He's looking at it from the perspective of how many asses did they put in the seats. He's looking at it, I don't want to say purely, because I'm sure he's inferring that they were just very small. And so which is a funny view to take when you think about it. I mean, he signed with AEW, which is a company that has an awful lot of smaller wrestlers. I wonder what those guys think of Jake's comments. But I think he's coming at it in that podcast he did from the perspective of, they don't compare to Hogan, they don't compare to Austin and people like that because business was bad or business was down. And it was. Business would have been a lot worse had Bret not been the champion and gotten over the way he did, because Bret was very popular. But was Bret Hulk Hogan 1986 popular? Was Bret Steve Austin 1998 popular? No. Not in this country, maybe elsewhere. For whatever reason, they loved him in Germany and Italy and all these other countries. Canada, obviously. So yeah, if you're going to compare it to those guys, then no. Business was not the same. The reactions were not the same. There's very few people who are up in that rarefied air that Hogan and Austin and maybe Rock, maybe put Rock on that list. That's rarefied air. Not many people are up there. Bret and Shawn, they're one tier below that. And I say that as a Bret fan. They're not all on the same level. They're one level below. So I'm not going to tear apart with Jake. I disagree with Jake when he says that they were two of the worst champions in history. Because there is evidence that, you know, business would have been far worse at that time in 94 if Bret wasn't on top as the champion. You know, there's a reason why they went with him instead of Lex Luger. You know, Lex Luger looked like $1 million. He might have been physically more impressive than Bret Hart, but you think the company was doing poorly in 94, they would have gone to shit if Lex Luger was the champion. Shawn Michaels, 96, yeah, business wasn't great, but from what I remember, house show business with Shawn as champion was actually pretty strong. Maybe TV ratings weren't, but you know, it's not as though that the buildings were mostly empty when he was the champion. So I don't even know that that's really totally fair of him to say that. But he's an old school guy, and he probably doesn't, you know, he looks at things a certain way. It's hard to break that. You know, he came up in the land of the giants. He made another comment Jake did during that podcast interview where he was talking about, I don't know if it was Bret or Shawn or somebody else, but he was talking about somebody and, imagine putting them in the ring with Andre. He's like, oh, my point's been made. Would you be able to buy into the fact that they could ever stand toe-to-toe with Andre the Giant? Andre the Giant was the relic of a different era. Andre the Giant in any other era, yeah, he would have been a big guy. But wrestling changes. That was the era of the Giants. So Andre could go in there with a lot of other people who were similar in size to him. Big John Studd and Bundy and Hogan. Hogan was a big guy. Even Jake. Jake's a big guy. Jake's a big, tall guy. But it was just a different time. If you're gonna make that comparison, I mean, my God, who on the AEW roster could stand up to Andre the Giant? Are we really basing everything around who would look believable in the ring with Andre the Giant? Is that what we're doing now? It's just a different time. But Austin and Bret talked about their match at Survivor Series in '96. Bret called it a 4-star match. They both seemed to agree it was not their best match. It was definitely not as good or as classic as their match at WrestleMania. But it's a match that gets overlooked because everybody tends to talk about the submission match at WrestleMania 13. But the Survivor Series '96 match, which was Bret's comeback match at MSG, was actually very good. Austin takes great pride in blowing up Bret. They showed Bret at the very end of the match kind of breathing heavily, and I think he said the word fuck, if I remember. And Austin was laughing gleefully. He goes, I blew you up. I take great pride in that. They did talk about the WrestleMania 13 match, one of the greatest matches in really the history of that entire company. Forget WrestleMania. And that was the big match with the double turn, and Bret was not convinced that this was the right thing to do. He was very worried about turning heel, and Vince said, oh, it's going to work. It's going to be great. It's going to be great. I'm going to turn you heel. You're going to be a babyface to all the foreigners, but you're going to be a heel here in the U.S. And Bret was more concerned about losing all of the merch money. As a babyface, people buy your t-shirts, they buy your gear, your glasses, all your shit. And he's like, you're going to turn me heel. Nobody's going to buy my stuff. My paycheck's going to go down. And what really convinced him was Vince put together a list. He showed Bret a list of 5 guys that he would be working with if he was a babyface and 5 guys that he would be working with if he was a heel. He was far more impressed by the list of babyfaces that he would be working with as a heel, as opposed to, and he name dropped Vader. And Austin was quick to say, Leon passed away, God rest his soul and all that, but Bret said, he was like a teddy bear, but you didn't want to be in the ring with him because he would beat the fuck out of you, So he's looking at these lists and he's saying, well, if I'm a babyface, I'd have to work with Vader. He goes, maybe I'll turn heel. I like this list of opponents as a heel a lot better. Because then he would get to work with people like Austin. He'd get to work with Undertaker and, people like that he liked to work with. Austin was sitting at home with a knee injury. He didn't even know it was going to be a submission match. He found out about it like all of us did. He was watching on TV because he had tweaked his knee a few weeks earlier. And now he's sitting on the couch going, wait a minute, what the fuck? A submission match? I'm not a submission wrestler. I got no submission holds. I guess outside of maybe the $1 Million Dream. He goes, I got no submission holds. I'm a brawler. So he wasn't very happy about that. And they had a lot of praise for Ken Shamrock. He was sort of the enforcer. They got permission to brawl into the crowd largely because Shamrock was going to be there to watch their back. So if anybody got out of line, you've got Ken Shamrock, this guy from the Ultimate Fighting World, who's going to put this person in their place if they try to interfere in this match. So they thought Shamrock did a great job, and Bret was very adamant. He goes, submission matches are hard to do. He goes, he said he had a submission match that was one of the worst matches he ever had, if not the worst match that he ever had, with Bob Backlund. That was a little bit different. That was not a submission match. It was an I Quit match. They did have I think the submission match was at Survivor Series, which was a few months earlier. That's when Backlund won the WWF title. But he called the match with Backlund at WrestleMania 11 the worst match of his career, and it was. that match sucked. He said, no offense to Bob, because he and Bob Backlund, even the Survivor Series 94 match where he lost the championship, told a story. Owen on the outside pleading with his parents, throw in the towel, please, he's crying. But in the summer of 94, It was a July 94 episode of WWF Superstars, and I really wish they would get off their ass and upload these other years of Superstars. Right now they only have 1992, which is great, but I wish they would put up the other years as well. They had a tremendous match on TV. That was the night that Bob snapped. Backlund lost. And he snapped, and we got the birth of Crazy Bob. So the two of them actually had a tremendous match together in 94 on TV. But that match at WrestleMania 11 was the shits. I got to agree with Bret. And Bret made it very clear. He said submission matches suck. You know, he kept talking about his match with Austin at WrestleMania. It was meant to be more of like a high school fight. That's how he pictured it in his head. He says, you know, he wanted it to kind of look real and feel real and, you know, nice and stiff. And he said the nut shot that Austin at one point gave Bret, he gave Bret a kick right in the crotch in the corner. And Bret said, even the ball shot that you gave me, that was great. It wasn't one of those ones that Ric Flair gives. Any chance to take a little dig at Ric Flair? Bret Hart does not like Ric Flair. Bret Hart does not like Ric Flair. And the comments that Bret would make about Flair, that goes all the way back to the early 90s when they were in two different companies. They do not like each other. At least Bret doesn't have much love for the Nature Boy. But they basically did a whole analysis of their match at WrestleMania, and I love the way they splice in footage of the matches on these Austin podcasts, so they're sitting there watching the match along and commenting on it. That's one of the aspects of the show that I love when they do that. So they talked about that whole thing, and you know, they talked about how losing a match, you can lose and it can still make you. It can still make your entire career. Bret felt that he was a made man by losing to the Bulldog at SummerSlam in 92. Austin says, look, I lost both matches to you. I lost at Survivor Series 96, and I lost at WrestleMania 13, and I still got over. He says, I never won a match against you. Stone Cold never won a match, unless it was maybe like a DQ or something. He never won a match against Bret Hart. He never pinned him. He never made him submit. He never really beat Bret Hart, and he's not mad about it because how could he be mad? Those two matches made his career. It launched him to another level. So that's an example of how even losing can really make somebody. You don't always have to win. They talked about the match with Austin and Owen at SummerSlam in 97 and what, you know, went wrong there. And he had to change his style, Austin did, when it was over because he couldn't do a lot of the fancy stuff, technical stuff anymore. He became more of a brawler. And so they talked a little bit about Owen, and obviously Bret would love to see him in the Hall of Fame. They didn't, you know, dwell on it too much because what is there to dwell on? I mean, we all know why he's not in the Hall of Fame. I don't see that changing anytime soon. They talked about the 10-man tag at Canadian Stampede in July of 97. Bret is the only surviving member of that team, Team Canada. So when you go back and watch the match, it's a great match, but when you see the entrances and Brian Pillman comes out and Jim Neidhart comes out and British Bulldog comes out, Owen Hart comes out, and then here comes the sole survivor. Here comes Bret Hart. All the loss in that family. It's just unbelievable. It's like, I'd say second only to the Von Erichs. Second only to the Von Erichs when it comes to family tragedies in wrestling. I mean, I guess you could say Benoit. I'm looking at it in terms of like, quote, wrestling families, but yeah, Benoit would actually be at the very top of the list. But you think about the Von Erichs and you think about the Hart family and all the extended members of the Hart family and how many are gone. Bret took great pride in the fact that he never injured anyone. He could be stiff enough to make things look real and to make things look believable, but he was taught by guys in Japan, you know, how to make things look really brutal without actually hurting anybody. And that led into the discussion about Bill Goldberg, which to me in a lot of ways was the highlight of this whole. He just went off on Goldberg. He went off on Goldberg. He's clearly very annoyed that Goldberg is in the Hall of Fame. Everybody that he worked with, he said he was just totally unprofessional and dangerous. Kurt Hennig used to do matches with Goldberg and be all banged up when they were over. He told Goldberg before their match at Starrcade, which really led to the end of Bret's career, he said, look, don't hurt me. Don't go crazy and don't hurt me. Now, what's kind of weird about this is that I've heard Bret do interviews before where he's almost like forgiven Goldberg. And he said, bro, Goldberg was a nice guy. Just, it's just one of those things that happened. In his own book, Bret called Goldberg a good man who didn't know his own brute strength. And he and Goldberg have reunited over the years at like autograph signings and stuff. And I thought things were cool now between the two of them. I guess Goldberg has given interviews before where he's also had a change in tune, and he sort of disavowed any responsibility, and Bret should have known that it was coming and all that kind of stuff. But Bret's done the same thing where he'll say good things about Goldberg in one breath, but then here, and in a lot of the more recent interviews that he's done, he just goes off on Goldberg and says, I can't believe they put him in the Hall of Fame for hurting as many wrestlers as he hurt. You know, and usually without any consequence, he said. He would go back and in the locker room and get a pat on the back for how good of a job he did. And, you know, meanwhile, you're scraping his opponent up off the mat. So he did not mince words here in this interview when it came to Bill Goldberg. And that's one of the things I like about Bret is that, yes, sometimes he comes across as being very whiny and just overly complaining about stuff. He does. He does. And he has a very high opinion of himself and a very high opinion of his own work, which I think is well-deserved. His body of work speaks for itself. But the thing I like about Bret is when he does an interview like this, he's not going to sugarcoat shit. He's not going to come on and toe the company line. He's not going to come on and say good things just because he doesn't want to get on the bad side of Vince McMahon and WWE and not be invited back to do stuff like this. He doesn't give a shit. He doesn't need any of this. He'd be perfectly content to just, you know, live his life with his new wife and do what he does. He doesn't need any of this. So when he does an interview, he doesn't hold back. He doesn't hold back. He gives his opinion for what it is. If you don't like it, tough shit. That's what I like and respect about Bret Hart. So if you missed the interview, I did go through a lot of the key stuff. That's not everything. Always better to hear it in Bret's words, of course. If you haven't seen it, you got time to kill, which of course everybody now has time to kill, because what the hell else are we supposed to do? We can't go anywhere. You can go on the network. I would say it's worth a watch. All of these interviews that Austin has done so far have been very good. I don't know who he's interviewing next. If I think, who would I like to see sit down with Stone Cold in an interview like this? I would say Brock Lesnar, and I know he's already interviewed Lesnar. He interviewed Lesnar on the Stone Cold podcast on the network. It's basically the same thing, just with a different name. He also interviewed Big Show, but I love the new Big Show interview. Maybe he can get Brock back in the studio with him, and he can ask Brock other questions that they didn't talk about the first time. If he could get Brock to open up, I think Brock would be a fascinating guy for him to sit down with the second time. Vince McMahon, why not sit down with him a second time? They only scratched the surface of what they could talk about. There's been so many new things that have happened in the years since they did their interview. I'd love to see Vince McMahon sit down and do another 2-hour interview with Steve Austin. The one I'd really like to see also him get, and it's just a matter of timing, I think, is The Rock. I'd love to see Stone Cold and The Rock just sitting back, drinking tequila and beer and just shooting the shit for 2 hours, talking about wrestling and life and what it was like to work together and the Attitude Era and all that stuff. I think that would be great.